Chapter: Shadows of the Mind. The aroma of freshly made sandwiches filled the small kitchen of Aunt May's home. Peter Parker sat at the worn wooden table, drumming his fingers absent-mindedly as his mind drifted. He had been feeling on edge lately. His last encounter with Shellshock had rattled him more than he'd like to admit. Aunt May, with her usual gentle smile, walked into the room carrying a plate stacked with sandwiches. "You're looking a bit thin, Peter." "Here, eat up," she said warmly, setting the plate in front of him. Peter's stomach growled in agreement, and he wasted no time digging in, taking a big bite as Aunt May sat across from him. Thanks, Aunt May," he said through a mouthful. She chuckled. "It's my job to keep you fed, you know. Now, catch me up. What's new?" Peter smiled, glad for the distraction. "Well, for starters, you'll never believe this, but I actually have a job interview at Horizon Labs. It looks promising." Aunt May's eyes lit up. "Oh, Peter, that's wonderful. You've always had such a brilliant mind. They'd be lucky to have you." He swallowed another bite before adding, "And I'll be getting a nice check from the Bugle soon. Took some pretty great shots of Spider-Man." Aunt May sighed, shaking her head. "I really don't like that you follow that masked menace around for pictures. It's so dangerous." Peter rolled his eyes. "Aunt May, Spider-Man's not as bad as Jonah makes him out to be." She folded her arms. "Well, explain to me how he and that Shellshock character went on a rampage at Stark Expo. You're lucky the Avengers weren't around, or Tony Stark would have put an end to it." Peter nearly choked on his sandwich. "That's not exactly how it happened," he muttered. Aunt May continued as if she hadn't heard him. "I just wish you'd be more careful, dear. I worry about you." Peter sighed, finishing off his sandwich and reaching for the glass of milk. He took a sip and immediately made a face. "Ugh. Aunt May, I think this milk's gone bad." She smiled knowingly. "You caught me. I switched to almond milk. It's supposed to be healthier." Peter groaned. "This is a betrayal." May chuckled as she got up to put the milk away, but before she could take a step, Peter's spider sense exploded in his skull. "GT down," he yelled, lunging towards Aunt May just as the west side of the house erupted in a fiery explosion. The shockwave sent dishes flying from the cabinets. Wood splintered, furniture overturned, and dust filled the air. Peter instinctively wrapped his arms around his aunt, shielding her from the blast as debris rained down. Through the smoke and flames, a smug, armored figure stepped into the kitchen. "Hey, Pete," Shellshock said, voice dripping with amusement as he strode forward. Peter's heart pounded. "Shellshock?" he gasped, pushing Aunt May behind him. The armored villain spread his arms. "Surprised? Are you surprised?" "You look surprised." Peter clenched his fists. "Why are you here?" Shellshock took a slow step forward. "Because, Peter, I know you're Spider-Man." Peter felt his blood run cold. "That's impossible," Shellshock scoffed. "Did you think you were the only one investigating? You were sloppy. You take pictures of Spider-Man at our last 2 fights, yet I never saw you there. And then," he cocked his head, smirking under the helmet, "you've been prancing around Hayes Industries, climbing walls, jumping out of skyscraper windows. Not very subtle." Aunt May, coughing from the smoke, gripped Peter's arm. "Peter, what's happening?" she asked in confusion. Peter's mind was racing. He knew. Shellshock knew. "Aunt May, I need you to run," Peter said firmly. "I'll distract him." Before Shellshock could react, Peter grabbed a frying pan and slammed it against his helmet. A loud clang echoed through the ruined kitchen, leaving a noticeable dent on the metal. Shellshock stumbled slightly before whipping his head around in disbelief. "A frying pan? Really?" he yelled. "Seemed appropriate," Peter shot back before tackling Shellshock, sending both of them crashing into the living room. They tumbled across the floor, knocking over the coffee table and shattering a lamp. Shellshock threw Peter off him with a powerful kick, sending him hurtling through the front door. Peter crashed onto the front lawn, groaning as he rolled to his feet. He barely had time to recover before Shellshock marched through the ruined doorway. Peter sprinted behind a tree, changing into his suit at record speed. When he emerged, now fully dressed as Spider-Man, Shellshock laughed. "Gotta love a quick change," he quipped. "Let's finish this," Peter growled. The fight ignited once more. Shellshock charged forward, throwing a devastating punch. Spider-Man dodged, flipping over him and landing a powerful kick to his back. Shellshock staggered but recovered quickly, countering with a concussive blast from his gauntlets. Spider-Man barely managed to avoid the shockwave, webbing onto a tree and launching himself back into the fray. They clashed violently, smashing into parked cars and tearing up the yard. Every time Shellshock swung, Spider-Man narrowly avoided the blows, countering with rapid strikes. Finally, the two locked hands in a test of strength. "You're no match for me, Peter," Shellshock growled, pushing Spider-Man back inch by inch. Spider-Man's frustration boiled over. "Who are you?" he roared. Shellshock chuckled. "Pete, if I wanted you to know that, do you think I'd be wearing a mask?" "That's it. I'm done playing games." Peter snapped. He landed a devastating uppercut, followed by a rapid flurry of punches. Shellshock stumbled back, dazed, dropping to his knees. Peter seized the moment. He ripped Shellshock's helmet off, only to reel back in horror. It was him. Beneath the armor, staring back at him with a twisted smirk, was Peter Parker. "What's wrong, Pete?" Shellshock Peter asked with a grin. "Didn't see that coming?" Peter's breath hitched. His hands trembled. His mind screamed in confusion. And then Peter jolted awake. He sat up in bed, drenched in sweat, breathing heavily. His heart pounded so hard it echoed in his ears. A dream. It was just a dream. He pressed a hand to his forehead, trying to shake the feeling of dread clinging to him. "What the hell was that?" he muttered to himself. The memory of the other him, of Shellshock wearing his face, lingered in the back of his mind. And for the first time in a long while, Peter truly felt afraid. Peter sat slumped in his work chair, staring blankly at the ceiling. Above him, pinned to the plaster, was a chaotic arrangement of pictures, articles, and notes, all connected by red yarn that stretched across like a tangled web. His eyes traced the strands of yarn from one point to another: a Stark Expo robbery newspaper clipping, a photo of the Wakandan embassy, a printed schematic of the turbines he'd taken from Shellshock's armor, and a map of Hell's Kitchen dotted with red X's. Every single thread ultimately led to one picture in the center of the ceiling, a blown-up image of Shellshock. He rubbed his temples in frustration, turning his gaze back to his computer screen. On it was an old Daily Bugle article about Lily Hayes' death. He had read it several times now, but the words still hit hard, no matter how many times he skimmed them. Just like Calvin had said, Lily Hayes had been a truly remarkable person. She dedicated her life to helping others, especially the underprivileged families of Hell's Kitchen. She had started a nonprofit daycare for low-income families and led countless outreach programs aimed at improving the lives of children in the area. But one night, after leaving the daycare center she'd poured her heart into, Lily was walking to her car when tragedy struck. A mugger had approached her, demanding money and jewelry. But Lily, ever humble, didn't carry anything of significant value. Enraged, the thief shot her and fled. The only thing the gunman took was a necklace with a small turtle charm, worth a measly $35. The police never found the killer. Peter leaned back in his chair, staring at the article. The story reminded him so much of Uncle Ben, a good person caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. It wasn't fair. It was never fair. He glanced up at the picture of Shellshock on the ceiling again. "Is this what it's all about?" Peter muttered to himself. Hayes isn't just mad at Hell's Kitchen. He's trying to punish it for taking his daughter. But something didn't quite add up. Hayes was a powerful man, a CEO with enough influence to reshape the neighborhood legally if he wanted to. Why resort to such drastic measures, stealing advanced tech, working with Shellshock, and gathering resources that could level entire city blocks? What was the end game? Peter sighed, turning back to his desk. The connection between Shellshock and Calvin was becoming clearer, but their role in Hayes' larger scheme still felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. And then there was the connection to vibranium. Why would Hayes care about Wakandan tech? He stared at the computer screen, rereading the article about Lily one last time. "You deserved better," Peter said quietly. He thought about the small, cheap necklace the thief had taken, a random act of violence that ended a life devoted to helping others. Peter clenched his fists. It wasn't just about stopping Hayes or Shellshock anymore. It was about justice for Lily, for Uncle Ben, and for anyone else who had suffered because of greed, anger, or a broken system. "All right," Peter said, standing up and pulling his mask off the table. "Time to get back to work." Peter's morning had been a whirlwind. After selling photos of the Wakandan embassy attack to the Daily Bugle, he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt as J. Jonah Jameson gleefully prepared a front-page spread with the headline, "Spider-Man and Shellshock Attack." Jameson's relentless spin was predictable, yet it always stung. With the check from the Bugle, Peter picked up medicine for Aunt May. She fussed over his thin appearance, insisting he sit down to a hearty breakfast. The warmth of her concern was a brief respite from the chaos of his double life. Despite his efforts, the Shellshock case remained a tangled web of unanswered questions. Determined to make progress, Peter decided it was time to reconnect with Calvin Drax, his old academic rival from Columbia University. Calvin had always been reserved, a brilliant mind from Hell's Kitchen who secured a coveted internship at Smith Industries, a position Peter had also vied for. Since then, their paths hadn't crossed, but Peter hoped that rekindling their acquaintance might shed light on recent events. Tracking Calvin's routine was surprisingly straightforward. After a session at the gym, Calvin headed to a local coffee shop. Peter took a deep breath, steeling himself for the encounter, and approached Calvin just as he was about to place his order. "I'm sorry, excuse me, Calvin. Calvin Drax?" Peter feigned surprise. Calvin turned, his brow furrowing in recognition. "Parker? From Dr. Connor's class?" Peter nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, Columbia University. It's been ages. How have you been? Do you have time to catch up?" Calvin hesitated, glancing at his watch, but then offered a small smile. "Sure, why not?" They found a table and settled into a conversation that flowed more easily than Peter had anticipated. They reminisced about Dr. Connor's quantum mechanics class, agreeing it was one of the most challenging courses they'd taken. Calvin shared his experiences at Smith Industries, where he had delved into advanced manufacturing technologies. He spoke of his current role at Hayes Tech Innovations, where he led research and development initiatives. Peter listened intently, noting the passion in Calvin's voice. When the conversation shifted to Peter's endeavors, he mentioned his freelance photography for the Bugle, but expressed a desire to return to the scientific field. "I'm actually looking for opportunities to get back into science," Peter said, choosing his words carefully. "Do you know of any openings in your department?" Calvin's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of suspicion crossing his features. "It's interesting you'd ask now," he said slowly, "given the recent incidents." Peter feigned ignorance. "Incidents? I've been a bit out of the loop with work and family stuff." Calvin studied him for a moment before his expression softened. "Well, we are always looking for talented individuals. I can forward your resume to our HR department." Peter smiled, masking his inner turmoil. "That would be great, Calvin. I appreciate it." As they parted ways, Peter couldn't shake the feeling that Calvin was hiding something. The encounter had provided little concrete information, but it reinforced Peter's suspicion that Calvin was more involved in the recent technological thefts than he let on. Determined to uncover the truth, Peter resolved to keep a closer eye on his former classmate. Peter, clad in his Spider-Man attire, leaped effortlessly from one building to the next, keeping a vigilant eye on Calvin Drax as he navigated the city streets below. Calvin's tailored suit made him conspicuous in the rundown neighborhood he was entering. Peter's curiosity intensified as he watched Calvin stride confidently through the area. Suddenly, Calvin vanished from Peter's sight. Alarmed, Peter scanned the surroundings and spotted two thugs dragging Calvin into a grimy alley. The narrow passage was cluttered with dumpsters and litter, the walls stained with years of neglect. Perched atop a dumpster was a young man in a gray hoodie, swinging his feet nonchalantly, the apparent leader of the group. "You know where you're at, Jeeves?" The leader taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. Calvin remained silent, his demeanor unflinching. From his vantage point on a nearby rooftop, Peter tensed, ready to intervene but choosing to observe for the moment. One of the thugs shoved Calvin harder against the wall. "My boy asked you a question," he snarled. The other thug brandished a pocket knife, a sinister grin spreading across his face. Calvin's composure was unwavering. "I know exactly where I am. I grew up a few blocks from here. What are you doing here?" the knife-wielding thug demanded. "I'm looking for Screech," Calvin replied calmly. The thug glanced back at the young man on the dumpster. In a swift motion, Calvin seized the thug's hand, headbutted him, and swung his briefcase into the other assailant, sending him sprawling. The leader's eyes widened in recognition. "Hold on, Jeeves, are you Drax?" Calvin nodded as the two thugs regained their footing, now both brandishing knives. "Stand down, boys." "Jeeves here has an appointment," the leader commanded, raising his hands to pacify the situation. "You got the money?" Calvin reached into his coat and produced an envelope. The leader signaled to his thug, who took the envelope and counted the cash. 10 grand. It's all here." Satisfied, the leader retrieved a flash drive from his pocket and tossed it to Calvin. "That's some of my best work. I have a year-long waiting list. If you didn't used to run the streets with my brother, I wouldn't have done this for you. How is Franklin? Calvin inquired, pocketing the flash drive. He's in Rikers. Could be better, the leader replied, hopping off the dumpster. One of the thugs knocked on a nearby door, and the group began to file inside. He told me to tell you, you're lucky you made it out, Calvin. He's proud of you. Calvin nodded appreciatively as the door closed behind them. He then turned and exited the alley. From his perch, Peter shook his head in bewilderment. What the hell is going on? He muttered, the pieces of the puzzle becoming more convoluted with each revelation.
Hey guys, it's Shellshock. Thanks for tuning in. First of all, I would like to apologize that it took me so long to update. I got a lot of projects in the works right now, and unfortunately, my videos are suffering for it. And if you are following me for these videos, I do want to apologize about that. I will try to keep a better schedule and a handle on things. But on the plus side, I do have a lot of more videos coming out. I have a lot of projects in the works, and hopefully I can get them out soon, and you guys will check them out. Thanks for tuning in, and we got 2 chapters left. See you soon.